It was an extraordinary revelation.
It kind of informs almost every level of my life.
It changed me utterly.
It sticks with me as something really beautiful and important.
It gives a sense of longevity to my life.
I do feel part of something that's bigger than me.
As you get older and you kind of see the tracks of your life disappearing into the past, I don't think I would have opted for any other way of living.
At some point, we moved into Camden. We found a squat. The squatting was easier in Camden.
I knew someone from Belfast who knew people in the co-op.
A friend of a friend was a guy called Michael McGuinness who lived in 26. And in 26 there was a spare room.
It was through meeting Pete, Tim and Martin, and they encouraged me to consider joining the co-op.
I met a couple of them in Algiers.
I came over partly because I'd met some women who worked with the London Women's Film Group.
I fell in love with London. I fell in love with the people of the commune.
And so in 1972 I came back. I'd been living in Virginia and I came into London and moved into a squat with them.
Every year I came to London and I thought, well, I have to one day to come here and settle.
And I met Lance at bus conductor school in Gunnersbury.
I moved to London and moved in with Danny in the squat here in Fleet Road.
It kind of felt like it was part of a different way of living.
We wanted to create a future for ourselves.
It seemed to me that there was a real possibility.
There was a common thread going through whatever anybody was doing. There was a thread, and it was change.
Having our voice and challenging the things that were taken for granted, things that were seen as the only way to do things, the only way to be.
Making the world better, changing the world, changing the world.
Working and living as a cooperative and doing things together with people that somehow created something that was bigger than ourselves.
It was exciting.
Because there was a real belief that the personal was political, and the women's movement had really made that at the forefront of their politics. That changing the world started with us in our household.
And we wanted to live by example, I suppose.
For me, it was a kind of revelation that those people existed.
I was really mesmerised by the way people live.
I'd never really seen men wearing makeup before.
They were the first gay people that were similar to me in that they had the similar social and political outlook and long hair and were hippies.
Anti-conformist, so it's really everything I wanted.
Coming from the States, one of the first things I have to admit now was how poor everyone was here.
It was a very interesting experience for me to see how a community existed. It wasn't 100% gay, it was a mixed community.
Sometimes they kind of didn't really wear any clothes. That was a bit of a surprise to begin with, but I quite liked that as well.
People were welcoming, they were helpful, I didn't speak the language.
People that you wouldn't expect to be kind of friends.
Race wasn't an issue, we were all the same, and that was very, very strong and attractive.
I hitchhiked from Wales, which was a complete disaster. I got as far as Birmingham and then had to take a train, got to Euston and took a taxi to the squat. And it was about 1, 2 in the morning, and the taxi driver pulled up outside the house, took one look at it and said, "Oh, you can't be going there, mate. It's derelict."
It was two Victorian houses joined together through a big hole in the wall.
20 and 22 were a single unit. They were a single entity because a hole had been knocked in the wall.
There was no heating. There was one coal fire in the main room that everyone would huddle. There'd be 30 people huddling around this coal fire.
For some reason, there was something about the living room. 14 people would be in these 2 rooms and the other 7 rooms would be largely empty.
It was really rough. The infrastructure of the house was very poor.
We had electricity, we had water, we could cook things. It was livable.
Another memory that I really cherish is having a shower in the garden in winter.
A hose coming out the kitchen at 20 out into the buddleia tree.
The space was very collective.
You got the impression that it was a very fluid place.
I just liked the improvised nature of it.
The bedrooms weren't so clear. There were a lot of mattresses on floors and you didn't always know who would be in the same room as you.
I was kind of pissed off if I did come to bed and find somebody else in my bed that I hadn't specifically invited.
And then sometimes you go into your bedroom, there'd be somebody else there, so you couldn't even use your bedroom.
And sometimes they didn't even speak English.
The stories I've heard of when people were initially living in Fleet Road was that nobody even had a bed, really. You went to sleep wherever you found space to sleep.
I was wondering if I'd ever get to know everybody, because it seemed to be people just changed all the time.
We always had visitors. The door was never locked, never.
If someone needed somewhere to live, they just came and stayed here. And then eventually someone else would move out and they'd move in to the bedroom. It was very organic. There was no process. You didn't apply to come and live here. You just kind of slept on the floor if you needed somewhere to sleep.
The human side of the place made up for any shortcomings in the physical environment.
To begin with, it was about housing single people, both gay and straight.
I think it was about housing principally because you needed somewhere to live, and that was the most pressing need.
To some extent, it was a kind of necessity that brought people together.
The people in the co-op wanted to create a way of living and working together.
Finding a structure which was communal and non-hierarchical.
Very quickly became much more conscious and politically based.
What one was doing was a kind of political statement.
Roughly around, combating oppression and maybe even around combating patriarchy.
But basically, the main value that I hope we kept to was one of tolerance.
We all were willing to help each other, to respect each other.
Being in the co-op was an enormously important part of my political education.
I was politically really naive when I came to the co-op, I think.
The co-op's always been reasonably political. Certainly all the people I met would probably have defined themselves as socialist.
Everyone was into politics then.
I don't remember when we started meeting people from Gay Liberation Front.
Feminism and gay rights were sort of fundamental to the way we wanted to live.
In all the communes that we were living in, we were coming out to ourselves, or we were discovering our own sexuality.
No. Independent, self-reliant, where money allows, living their own lives,
in their own homes.
There were people who had been part of Marxist groups in London, anarchist groups. It was very, very left-wing. There were no neoliberals.
We were all against the war in Vietnam. We were all dubious about the British involvement in Northern Ireland.
That was another thing that attracted me, because I come from a very political family. My parents were involved in the Algerian War.
We were very aware of the miners' strike. That kind of almost seems like the end of an era, almost.
I don't think we can honestly say we did get housing right the last time we were in government, but this time we are determined that things will be better. We have some new answers, and they have to be new answers because problems are changing all the time. They add up to this. Anyone who wants to own his own home can expect help from a Conservative government. We know what that help will cost. It won't be cheap, especially at a time when money is tight. But it's a question of where you spend government money. We spend it where it is needed, and we know it's needed in housing.
If you were gay and political and didn't want to get married, or no, sorry, can't use that word, can we? If you didn't want to couple off and buy a house and work 9 to 5 and live with somebody, there were no options. You had to find a different way, and this was a different way.
Living communally really, really appealed to me. It made complete sense to me that people would want to live this way, and that was how the future might be, that there would be a way of people coming together and living together and sharing things.
It wasn't really a choice, you just had to do it, otherwise you'd suffocate.
Living together as a household was very nice.
From my particular background in the north of Ireland, being brought up as a Catholic, individuality wasn't so important as being part of a community.
It was liberating to be so open and seen all the time by your friends.
That idea of living in community as part of a group was maybe a part of who I was.
People want a home they can call their own. The last Conservative government encouraged councils to sell, but all too often Labour councils refused. This brought disappointment to many, many people. But this time, we're going to make it a matter of the law of the land. If you've been a council tenant for at least 3 years, you'll have the right, by law, to buy your house, and that's that.
It was very communal. It was one kitchen, one meal cooked a day. That was everybody ate.
Everybody put £5 a week into the kitty.
Food was bought collectively, and sometimes the food was great, sometimes it was horrible.
We lived with little money, very, very little money, but we ate well.
It was brilliant when Radia and Hader moved in because they were wonderful cooks.
I managed never to have to do any cooking.
You cooked for anybody. If anyone was here, they got food. You didn't say, oh, sorry, you can't eat, you're not a member of the collective. They ate. They weren't even asked.
I think my speciality was to do a meal when it looked like nobody else was. So it would be very late and people would be hungry and they wouldn't really mind what it was. I did my best.
We never ever voted on anything. We would always come to a consensus. Always.
Decisions were made via house meetings, and there were house meetings in each of the houses.
Although we didn't have a leader, someone would take a leader role and make decisions.
The people with the strongest voices just carried the day. And I suppose it's like anywhere, you find there's certain people that take charge a little bit. I think that's about groups and groups trying to work in an equal way.
You see, for years now in British politics, this word, you must use it, consensus has reared its head. You must have a consensus. It's a word, again, you used not to use when I first came into politics. We had convictions. And we tried to persuade people that our convictions were the right ones. And it's no earthly use having convictions unless you have the will to translate those convictions into action.
The people who lived here were very mixed.
It was a real kind of cross-section.
Coming from extraordinarily different places.
English, Scottish, middle class, working class.
North Africa, South America.
Algerians.
Refugees from Belfast, Protestants and Catholics.
All beginning to know that something was wrong, and they met other people in whom they found roughly the same questions being asked.
I was going to say it was all single people, but actually it wasn't, because there were certainly couples.
As time went on, there were more women. There'd been very few women to begin with.
Probably more heterosexual women than lesbian women, or women who identified as lesbians.
Gay men were still in the majority.
I think we were still kind of discovering a bit who we were in the context of the time.
The fact that we lived with women meant that you could not avoid feminist issues. You had to talk about them. You had to be aware of lesbian separatism because it was in your face all the time.
So here's our promise. We promise you the right, in law, to buy your council house at 1/3 below market price.
It was Pete Freer, me, Martin McCrudden, Sandy, Alan. That's it, there were 6 of us.
At that point, 5 or 6 people decided to make the move to Ireland.
1972, we left.
A core of 5 people moved to the west coast of Ireland, to County Mayo, to Castletown House.
And there was this talk about going back to countryside and the rural and a more natural life.
Pete had this vision of Utopia. I was the practical person. Pete Freer was the dreamer. He just wanted to get away.
As far as I was concerned, it was just, like Wonderland.
Heaven. It was beautiful.
It was this huge old manor house. It looked very elegant, and then of course you get up close and it's sort of starting to crumble slightly.
It had land round it, a stream running through it. Next to the stream it had a well, and it had trees, a wood.
You could walk to the sea.
It began with no electricity and tilly lamps, which could be serviced at Jameson Green Ironmongers in Belfast.
There wasn't really plumbing. There wasn't running water.
Water was being pumped by hand.
There was a well at the end of the garden. We used to have to go down and get water. The thing I really remember somehow was the kitchen. It had one of those huge big country kitchens with the larder behind, and there was a huge big table in the kitchen, and kind of life seemed to centre in the kitchen.
In winter it was magical. Every night, to fill all the kerosene lamps. It was like living in the 19th century or before. It was beautiful. I don't think we'd thought too much about how we were going to survive. There's the dreamer, the Pete dreamer, thinking that we didn't need money. Our first crop was curly kale, the most disgusting vegetable on earth, which I will never ever in my life eat again. Our animal husbandry was a complete and utter disaster. We had a load of geese. They were all males. We never got any eggs off of them. We had ducks, beautiful ducks, and one by one they got eaten by the foxes. And then we got the goats. Alan, more than anybody else, was hugely angry about Derry, 1972, and the shootings, he saw it as his mission to do something about that. And we hatched this extraordinarily crazy scheme where we were going to bring 6 school children, Protestant school children, and 6 Catholic school children from communities in Derry and Belfast, and we'd bring them to Castletown without any water, without any electricity, and we'd plonk them down, we'd feed them, and we'd make them play together. It was as simple as that. It was incredibly naive, incredibly direct, and it sort of worked. We had loads of groups. It got very dangerous. I mean, one of the minders was killed when it was found out what they were doing. They were killed. They were shot.
I remember when they decided that they couldn't keep it up anymore, and I was so upset.
There were probably several reasons. One to do with the isolation of living so far away in Ireland. There wasn't a lot of money, so people were taking it in turns to go back to London to work and earn money and then come back to the house. And that was very hard. It was quite difficult for Sandy. For a time, she couldn't go out on her own without people really being aggressive towards her as one woman living with 6 men. There was religious shit going on. There was cross-border shit going on. You'd wake up in the morning, come downstairs and find people you didn't know sitting at the table saying, don't go outside the house for the next 3 hours.
And we decided to do what the Irish do. We decided to emigrate back to London. So we went back to London. Fleet Road had been squatted and there wasn't space for us.
In everything we do, we are trying to help, and we are trying to be practical, and we are trying to spend money wisely. Our new policies are designed for the needs of today. A nation of homeowners will be self-reliant, independent, and able to do what they want in their own lives, in their own homes.
The co-op didn't have enough accommodation to house all the members.
We started to squat more places.
Other houses were squatted independently of the group.
There were kind of lots of satellites, in a way. You know, there were other communal houses where we knew people, or people might move from one to the other, and there was always sort of connection.
It was kind of collectivised because we understood that we were stronger together than we were apart. So it seemed sensible that these houses became affiliated. New friendships were formed, and those friendships were incorporated into the structure of the group. People almost certainly had sex with other people in those properties. In my view, the strength of that community emerged from those kind of processes of love.
I can't remember the next series of events. I mean, within some of this, somewhere Alan kills himself. After that, Alan died, Pete slowly became alcoholic and it killed him too.
There was the odd hiccup over the years, or more than the odd hiccup.
For me, at least, it's the start of the breakup of the houses into separate flats.
It's the same thing all the world over. There's a bunch of people, and sometimes people fall out with one another, or they argue, or there are jealousies. And of course, some people were involved with one another.
The only substantial conflict that I remember was in just how wide a latitude for accepting people should be.
There was a huge problem with the Orange people.
The Orange people were a sort of religious cult.
It was an Indian yogi who collected Rolls Royces, basically.
It was getting harder to get things done politically, and a lot of people seemed to be giving up and joining the Orange people.
Some of these people were friends of the group, and they kind of didn't have anywhere to live. So they came and lived downstairs of 24.
And it was just the sheer numbers, I think.
They stayed for a while and then they wanted to stay permanently.
And eventually, as I say, several people moved out over this to next door.
I think this goes to the heart of this idea of who the co-op is. The people who felt this was too much wanted them to be excluded. That never happened. It maintained its openness to all who came.
Mr. Speaker, may I point out precisely what has been done? I understand that there is something like just over 1,000 people who sometimes sleep out rough in London. Some of them have other problems, such as they are mentally retarded, and they have genuine problems and are genuine social cases. Others are not.
You can speak to me. Say something to me. And Stephen too. Do you want to see the magician? Claude!
When children come into the scene, everything changes.
Tony Rampling really had the first child in the... I keep saying the co-op. I never thought of it as the co-op. It was in the commune. I didn't have any particular interest in children until I had my own.
They wanted to have children with no recognition of the effect that would have on other people who lived in the properties.
Basic to feminism, to women's liberation, that women should control their own fertility, and if they wanted to have children, that was fine by me. Although some people were very clear about not wanting to live with children, they were always very nice to them. Mainly some of the gay men decided that they didn't want to live with children.
Eventually we had to split. 20 and 22 had to divide into two. Into the people who were interested in childcare and wanted to be involved in it, and the people who weren't.
Yes. You like that?
And that was one of the factors that prompted our expansion up the road.
And that meant that the central kind of core was split into two. Actually, after that, it meant designing properties became a lot easier because we weren't living in a large collective, communal. We were living in two smaller collectives. And during that process, I actually kind of started to look forward to living alone.
Around the same time, the government came up with this thing called an amnesty for squatters.
We suddenly realised at the age of 27 that we may not be dead at 30.
We couldn't go on squatting indefinitely.
And the squats weren't comfortable. I mean, it was quite hard living.
We knew without even asking that as single people, there was nothing for us in the structure of local council housing.
The GLC started giving short life licences to squatters.
In properties that they weren't doing up and which people who were then living in them started to make repairs and make them habitable. There was a lot of uninhabitable housing.
So Abeona became a co-op.
And luckily there were people within the housing movement, within Camden Council, within all sorts of things, that would listen to these bunch of weirdos.
We got licences from the GLC, which meant that we were then able to get funding to put in some basic improvements in the houses.
There was definitely a sense of relief, I think, at becoming legitimate.
There was a big change. It sort of formalised things.
Heather, who'd come over from Algeria, with building skills. They were Mediterranean building skills and were a bit different from British ones. So me and Heather were the workers' team. It was lovely working with Heather. He's a nice person to work with. It was crazy, but it was fun.
I first went to Oval to see Gay Sweatshop, and I realised that this was an alternative space which was clearly very gay friendly. Bunch of alternative radical people, with quite a few of us working at an alternative radical theatre and community space that was about enriching people's lives.
Oval House was an alternative venue. Abeona was an alternative housing cooperative.
Oval House was a safe place.
There was very much a focus on race politics and community politics.
So I kept going back.
And it would be this bizarre mix of people, but there was a real sense of solidarity.
The community down there and the community here were very, there were crossovers.
Pete Freer had got the job cooking in Oval House.
The food at the Oval was not dissimilar from the food here. That's because Pete would cook there and I would cook here.
In the summer, there was a summer project where we'd all be involved with kids.
I did all the kids' projects.
And several members of Gay Sweatshop also became co-op members.
The economic input that Oval House had on the co-op was significant because it paid the wages of people who lived here. It financed, through labour, the ability of people to live in a certain way.
The connections between Oval and Abeona were about inclusion. We were trying to create a voice at Oval through the arts for people who were experiencing marginalisation in some way.
Not only were you living in a certain way, you were working in an environment that was as non-judgmental, as supportive as the environment here.
I'm enjoying this. I'm enjoying this.
The other thing that happened then was that people we knew started being diagnosed with HIV, and that really changed everything.
It had a huge impact.
In those kind of early days of HIV, it actually felt very dangerous.
There were people who were getting sick.
And at the time, that was a death sentence.
It was really atrocious.
None of us knew. Anyone and everyone could have been positive.
It was hard to see your friends die. It's hard to be with someone when they die.
I actually remember thinking of some of the people that I had slept with in my time and thinking, well, in 5 years, I'll know.
We thought as we were looking for funding for permanent housing and hoping to redevelop the houses, that we should include provision for people with HIV.
True to form, we found something and said, how can we deal with it? How can we integrate it into our lives?
Because we were able to determine who we prioritised in terms of housing need, and HIV was definitely one that everybody thought was good, because people were being discriminated against.
It seemed very good to be able to offer the one thing that people would need, which was a nice place to die. And dying at home, almost certainly, is less traumatic than dying in a hospital or a hospice.
It was a difficult time. It was also very unifying in lots of ways.
My brother, he had full-blown AIDS before he died, and the co-op provided him with a flat next to me.
Andy, who died here, was, I'm sure, very thankful that he was able to do it in his own space.
He lived his last moments with friends who live around here and with a sister who cared for him, and that I would always be grateful for.
I have to say that some of us, including me, were terrified. We'd found our little utopia and I didn't want anything to spoil it. I'll be as selfish as that about it.
That's how HIV changed the way the co-op saw itself.
But luckily there were other people around us, like Pete Freer, who saw further than I did.
If there had been no HIV, I wonder what would have happened, how different co-op might have been, how our various careers might have been different. And our world could have been a very different place. I can't remember exactly when it was that we first began to think about the big development. It must have been, I guess, in the mid-80s, late 80s.
We were able to buy the properties with Camden's money, which they gave us, and a promise to develop these properties.
Very few shoreline cars were able to do that.
The consequence of that was that we then had to start seriously thinking about the kind of housing that we would develop.
You can come by a 31 bus and get off at Chalk Farm Station, and it's about a 10-minute walk, 15-minute walk, 10-minute walk from there.
We were very clear from early on that it wasn't just about housing ourselves and our friends.
Once we started to become a body, a housing cooperative as opposed to just a bunch of people living together, then you have to start putting your politics where your mouth is a little bit more.
Getting all this public money, we didn't want it to be just about housing ourselves because it wouldn't be healthy.
It had more of a social purpose than that.
That goes back to living in communal houses, the whole experience of being open and welcoming people in.
We had an obligation to provide a certain percentage of housing to people that were on the council waiting list.
We made it very clear that we were providing housing for single people.
So the first people we took in that weren't original members were young people in need.
Yeah. You can get a C11 bus, and then you stay on the bus 2 more stops. After the hospital, you stay on it 2 more stops.
By the time we got to that point, nearly everybody, almost everybody, had decided that they wanted to live in one-bedroom flats.
And I remember feeling really doubtful. I did not want to lose the communal flats.
I think people were ready for their own spaces.
But when we were squatting, the situation was fluid. If you didn't get on with people, you could move to another house. But when we were talking about these plans and having these works done, I think everybody realised that this was permanent.
If we tried to get funding for communal living, that may have been very, very difficult.
We still wanted to retain some idea of our communality.
We did design, common areas and guest rooms, and sadly I don't think the common areas are really sort of being used the way we envisaged. We're stuck behind our little doors and we do sort of bump into each other, but there's much less collectiveness than there used to be. And I don't think that's quite what we expected.
I hated it. I utterly and completely hated it.
The co-op had got the money from the Housing Corporation to do Fleet Road.
One bit of the street was started before the others.
Number 10 Fleet Road was the first house.
That was really an exciting time.
People in the co-op were heavily involved in terms of how they wanted it all to look.
It's kind of a privilege, really, a gift, taking part in the design of your flat.
Tenant consultation is done in new developments now, but nothing like the extent to which the Abeona tenants were able to influence the design of their home.
But we had an architect with vision.
I think I remember the first time that I met the group.
I thought they were interesting.
I was quite nervous.
He knew what we wanted.
They were quite strong characters.
I think politically they were very sussed in terms of how to get support.
It was probably the first project where I had such close and direct engagement with the client.
Somehow there was something much more about the group than just housing.
They had a very strong vision and commitment to look beyond the immediate issue of providing homes for themselves.
That's how the group operated. I think that's one of their strengths.
Seeing the house coming up, every day there's something done, and it is like a dream come true.
He tore down everything behind it, so the facades were just left.
There was always a sense of people not only having their own spaces, but also there being a shared space for people to come together.
We'd made the decision to have at the back of the houses one long communal garden.
The snaking garden at the back.
And Stephen had shaped things so that balconies would look at each other but not too much.
Conveys a very strong sense of the co-op identity, I think.
People from the top can come to the garden through my balcony. There is no separation between balconies. It's just one long balcony. You can walk from the garden of one house to the garden of the next.
People met and talked.
That spirit of living communally is still there.
Back in the 70s, when we started, wider society was a lot like that TV programme, Life on Mars, And being here in our house was a haven away from all the sexism and racism and homophobia that people met outside. I don't know how Abeona will operate in the future. Also, I don't think that we can prescribe it. We can say how we'd like it to be, but I don't think there's any way that we can ensure that. It's really up to the people who come after us.
One of the things that I don't want to happen is that I end up in some kind of care facility that doesn't apparently have any lesbians or gay men in it. And it would be nice to feel that we had some control over where we might end up when we're old and frail.
To have developed this row of houses in NW3, I have no idea what the market value of it is. Millions. And not to have the ability to profit from it in any way is a serious achievement. It's a real pity that more people don't do that and think like that, because if they did, there'd be a much more diverse community, a much more interesting social space. You know, London would be a far more interesting place if there was more low-cost housing that people couldn't profit from.
I certainly don't want to own property. I think owning property is an inefficient way of housing people, really.
As the problems just get bigger and bigger out there, more and more people will realise we need collective solutions and not just individual little bolt holes.
Housing cooperatives are a good way of enabling people to have good quality housing that they feel in control of. There should be more.
And I like living here every time.
This would be the way I want to live.
This is definitely somewhere that I would really be interested in living.
It's like a group of people that care about each other. It works. It does work, and it just makes you feel much more close to everyone else.
Maybe I've been lucky because all my neighbours are really nice and stuff. Or maybe that's just the kind of people that are attracted to this kind of co-op.
I'm not close to my family other than my parents and my brothers, but I feel like in the cooperative there are people that I view as like cousins and aunts and uncles.
They discuss things like for people who doesn't have houses, like homeless people and we need to get some more bedrooms for kids who sleep with their mums.
I don't think society works in that everybody has an equal voice and an equal say, and I don't think that will change. I feel like I'm maybe more cynical than they were at my age.
That is very offensive.